Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, especially the opportunity this morning to say hello to a bunch of great pals and gals that I've worked with throughout the time that I was at Educate Texas and also worked in the Rio Grande Valley. It warms my heart that all of you are here today because it is an opportunity also to learn from each other. My name is Alma Garcia, and I'm the newest Trellis Foundation board member. I am the freshman, but let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I hit the ground running. I joined the board in 2020. It is my pleasure to introduce our opening conversation for the summit. As they are making their ways up to the front of the room, I want to note that the speakers and our moderator today are all highly accomplished in their respective fields, but also personally and professionally committed to the future of Texas and the success in our communities, not only in our great state of Texas, but in the nation. Dr. Mildred García serves as the president and CEO of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, with 23 member institutions and systems located in Texas, several of which are represented in the audience today. As ASCU president, Dr. García is an advocate for higher education at the national level, working to influence federal policy and regulations on behalf of the member colleges and universities. She is the first Latina to lead one of the 6 presidentially based higher education associations in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining ASCU, Dr. García served as the president of the California State University at Fullerton, the largest university in the California State University system and the 3rd largest university in the state. Under her leadership, the university saw a 30% improvement in the 6-year graduation rates and 65% improvement in the 4-year graduation rates for the first-time freshmen. Additionally, the achievement gap was eliminated for transfer students and cut in half for the first-time freshmen. And annual gift commitments also tripled under her leadership. We are delighted to welcome Dr. García to Texas and to this conversation. Next, we are joined by Margaret Spelling, President and CEO of Texas 2036, a nonprofit organization building on long-term data-driven strategies to secure Texas's continued prosperity for years to come. Just prior to joining Texas 2036, Margaret served as the president of the 17-institution University of North Carolina Systems, with a focus on improving economic mobility, ensuring accountability, and advancing the public good. Prior to that, Spelling served as president of the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas, Texas. And from 2005 to 2009, she served as the U.S. Secretary of Education, leading the implementation of the No Child Left Behind Act, a bipartisan initiative to provide greater accountability for the education of over 50 million U.S. public school students. As secretary, she also launched the Commission on the Future of Higher Education, a plan to address challenges of access, affordability, quality, and accountability in our nation's colleges and universities. Margaret brings tremendous knowledge and experience developed over an exceptional career in public education and service at both the state and national level. And we count ourselves very lucky that she and Texas 2036 bring such a valuable, data-informed perspective to everything we do together. In addition, we are thrilled to welcome Evan Smith, co-founder and CEO of the Texas Tribune. We're welcoming him back to the Trellis Foundation Summit, where he has been a tremendous partner, and he will be moderating the opening conversation this morning. Under Evan's leadership, the Texas Tribune has achieved wide acclaim, including the Peabody Award, the 23 National Edward R. Morrow Awards, and 3 General Excellence Awards from the Online News Association. You might also recognize him as the host of the Overheard with Evan Smith, a weekly interview program that airs on PBS. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Evan, Millie, and Margaret.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Very nice to be here, Dr. Rhodes. Nice to be in your house. Appreciate you having us all. Welcome, everybody. Let me give you a little housekeeping at the beginning here before we get started. We're going to talk for a portion of our time, and I do want there to be questions from all of you to bring into the conversation toward the back part. So I know you'll have better things to ask than I will. Please think of those. The other thing I'm going to note is that Secretary Spellings is a member of the Texas Tribune board. She is my boss. So Dr. García is going to get all the hard questions. Because I didn't just fall off a truck. I want to begin by truth testing the premises of this conversation that we're going to have today. Dr. García, you first. Is the public really as skeptical about the value of higher education as we imagine? Now, we see data suggesting that that's the case. We probably know anecdotally that the conversation about the value of higher ed has shifted, but I want to truth test this. In your sense, in your work, is the public really as skeptical as we think the public is?
The public is not monolithic.
Right, that's the first problem.
And that's the first issue, right? And the numbers are going up because ACE just did a survey saying that the public is interested in higher ed and important for the students and for the nation.
Right.
But in addition to that, when you go into the communities, what I call the new majority, the first generation, the low income, students of color and adults, in those populations, if you speak to them in their language and in their space, they will demonstrate to you that they understand that education is the path to a better life and economic independence. And there's no question about that. If you want, I could give you an example when I was at Dominguez Hills, where we had a fair with Univision, 109 partners, and it was on a Saturday morning. On the first year we did that, and when I was president, we had 5,000 families on our campus.
Right.
And when our students did the exit survey, and one of the fathers and mothers were asked, why are you here and why is this important? He said, because I understand this is a better life for my child.
So they get it. Those 5,000 families get it, the parents get it, the students get it. So who doesn't get it? We're being fed this idea that the public, again, broadly defined, is skeptical. You're giving us counter to that. Who's telling us it's skeptical?
Well, Go ahead, because I have a counter.
To me, it's relative to what? The value of post-secondary education relative to homeschooling your child who's here with you virtually, wages in Austin, Texas, where you can make $26 at Chick-fil-A, an in-demand market that makes the choice of pausing and taking on the challenges that we've just heard in the video, you know, people are a little more skeptical about it because of all the other external factors.
But Secretary Spellings, you work with the business community closely at Texas 2036 to understand what they need to get from here to there. They're not skeptical of the value of higher ed.
No, they are starving for more and better connectedness between the immediate value proposition of a student coming to work in their organizations.
So let me truth test the other premise here, which is that somehow higher ed has become unaffordable, and that as a consequence of that, people are beginning to question the value of higher ed. Do you believe higher ed, Secretary Spellings, is unaffordable?
Please call me boss or Margaret.
I know which one of those I'm going to choose. Boss. Do you really believe that higher ed is unaffordable, or is that another narrative that we take as fact, but there's actually evidence beneath that maybe that's not exactly right?
I think certainly it's an issue, but we have all collectively really worked hard on it. And it's, to me, it's not as much about affordability as it is about complexity. I mean, can you put together the toolkit of resources by going through a Gordian knot of processes and intrusion and whatnot to afford college? Yes, you can. But it's a process problem.
You know, Dr. García, the way I thought about it in preparing for this is the question about affordability more meaningful than simply annoying and inconvenient, right? Like, we all would rather not pay as much as we pay. I'm a parent of a kid in college. I'd like to be paying less or nothing, but that's not how this works. So my question is there really a barrier, or would we just prefer not to pay or to pay less?
Yes, there's a barrier for some. It's about cost of attendance. It's more than just tuition and books.
Right.
When you look at students who are working, taking care of families, single heads of household, they are really in need of a true cost of attendance and deferred income, right? Because they're not working full time. They're trying to go to school and work. And so it depends on who we're talking about. I'm going to say something else, and call me Millie, please.
No chance.
And what the other thing I would say is, when it's interesting that some people will say, well, a bachelor's or a post-secondary degree is not for everyone. And I always go back and say, are we talking about your children or your grandchildren?
Amen.
I think we need to start pushing back and use our bully pulpits more, and the value in what happens to our students once they graduate and move on into society to do great things.
We also need to acknowledge, as I'm looking at my friend Jacob here, and I'm looking at my friend William Serrata and Dr. Rhodes, that the conversation around what college costs is not the same across all of higher ed, right? We have different price points. I wonder, though, as I'm hearing you talk about this, if we believe in truth and transparency in pricing. In other words, if a family that doesn't necessarily have a great deal of sophistication in encountering higher ed as an entity comes to try to discover what it really costs, you say it's not just X, it's X, Y, Z, A, B, C. Is higher ed doing a sufficient job of educating students and families about what the true cost is?
We certainly need to do more.
Yeah.
We need to sit down with the families. We need to help them with the crazy FAFSA form, which is very intimidating.
Right.
We have to make sure that the students that are graduating from high school or from the community college are ensuring that they're filling out that FAFSA form and explain what is needed, and then talk about what is it that will cost you in the first year. Then we have to use our college funds, our scholarships, our state funds, our federal funds to ensure that they have the dollars. And we have to work on policy. Right now, ASCO and the 6 presidential organizations are fighting for double Pell, because we know that these students need the dollars in order to move forward.
Secretary Spellings, you did run a big university system. You actually have experience, line experience, being the person who would be guiding the degree to which the system provided adequate price transparency. How'd you do?
And I think the piece that we're missing here is price for what?
For what?
And I'm channeling our friend Tony Carnevale when I say this: what you study and the value immediately in the marketplace matters.
Yeah.
So if you're going to, cream puff private higher education and getting a, highfalutin liberal arts degree, and I love the liberal arts. My kids both went to liberal arts. All of that. But
sounds like you're describing me, but go on.
But and taking hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt to have a degree and fill in the blank. Yeah. It's just not a very good value proposition in the short term.
Right.
Now, what we learned from the commission that Millie and I served on and Millie chaired beautifully is that over time that all comes out in the wash. But if affordability is really a challenge for a family, and this is what community colleges do, they say, hey, the jobs are here in this field, here's the pathway, et cetera.
Right.
So make a smart decision and, use your pricing power to buy something that's going to be valuable immediately. And we aren't talking enough about that. We act like it's all the same and it's okay to get a Ph.D. in, I don't want to say because it'll offend someone, but they're not all created equal. Let's just say it.
I appreciate that you brought up the commission. So let's talk about that. This is the Postsecondary Value Commission. The Gates Foundation is in the lead spot on this. And Dr. Garcia, you are co-chair of this commission. You've done some amount of work on this question of the value of higher ed. What have the biggest insights been so far? And what are the things you've learned that become the basis for the difficult conversations that you have with higher ed leaders? I'm interested kind of for you to do both.
Okay, number one, I would say that we have to really use data to inform what is happening to our students.
Right.
What Margaret just spoke about, our institutions don't realize that it's important of the institution and the program to get you into economic independence. And so after that degree, how many years does it take for you to go above the high school level if you hadn't gone to college?
Yeah.
None of us do that. None of us in higher ed do that. Maybe there's one or two, but none of us do that. And I think that's important. The other thing is that we have to realize that the demographics has changed as it has in Texas.
Right.
And that we have to understand and take the students from where they are to where they need to be with student support services like we saw in that film,
Right.
that will help those students get through higher ed.
Well, as you point out, just as all institutions are not the same, all students are not the same. And the idea that there's a cookie cutter answer for every student just on its face doesn't make any sense.
And then I think the community colleges do a great job,
Yeah.
but the four-year institutions have to do a better job as to what are you prepared, what career are you preparing yourself for,
Right.
and help that student. What happens at our institutions, not, in my last year at Fullerton, we graduated 11,000 students. It's important for us to know, where did they go?
Yeah.
Did they go to graduate school? What career, and did we help them get into that career? And not say, oh, we're done, we're finished, we're successful. Because we should be following those students to see what happened to them with our education, and we don't.
Right. Secretary Spelling, so I looked up the website of this commission, which I wasn't really familiar with except at a very high level before, and I spent a bunch of time diving into the site and to the data. So here is how the Post-Secondary Value Commission defines value. Students experience post-secondary value when provided equitable access, so it's access, and support to complete quality, affordable credentials that offer economic mobility and prepare them to advance racial and economic justice in our society. There's data on this website, I guess tied back to a survey that you all did, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. Now, I saw the slides that Kristen put up that actually showed that the value of higher ed is starting to tick back up. There's data on the Post-Secondary Value Commission website that suggests the opposite. That pre-pandemic, when the question was put to people in the survey, what is college worth? Do you think there's a value in going to college? That it was 76% pre-pandemic said yes. Post-pandemic, 67%. So it dropped actually by 9%. And there are breakdowns by race. Black students asked about this, and black families actually found that the value had dropped more significantly. Hispanic families, slightly less significantly. What are we to make of that?
Well, those are, largely attitudinal and environmental kind of data points at
And they're snapshots of a moment.
a particular point in time. What was so helpful about the commission, and I want to commend our friends at the Gates Foundation who underwrote this work, and give ourselves in Texas as braggadocios great credit for having amazing data under the hood as part of the UT system that allows us to discern some of the stuff that Millie's talking about. And so right now, all of the accountability for quality and achievement and outcomes and whatnot in higher ed is on the student. They got it, they didn't get it, whatever.
Right.
And what we aim to do in this work is really discern the institutional value, the quality of the kind of effort that Millie's talking about. And what we learned, and I pulled it out because it's horrifying, 649 institutions, half of for-profit institutions, nearly 1/3 4-year and 2/3 2-year, failed to meet providing any value, zero. And so a lot of somebodies took a lot of debt to get nothing. And so we need to start making these discernments about the UC Fullertons that are killing themselves to track whatever, and provide those supports over time to those who just, get it or don't get it, pay our bill and see you later.
So Secretary, what is the assessment based on no value? This is the question that I've been wrestling with.
Well, it was a series of things.
Is the perception of diminished value more atmospheric and existential, or is it tangible? Can you put your hands on exactly? You've been about accountability going all the way back, right?
Yeah.
So you're all about accountability.
And data.
What we value, we measure. You always say this.
This is what was so beautiful about
So
this.
what is it?
About this UT stuff? It was about income. It was about living wage. It was about the meat and potatoes of did we do our job. It wasn't esoterica. It was about resources.
So it's not so much about educational attainment. It's not so much about academic performance on these campuses. It's about what happens after.
That's correct.
It's about the value after.
Yeah.
So Dr. Garcia, is there no relationship between value, real and perceived, and price of higher ed, or value, real and perceived, and cost of higher ed? How long have we been talking about price versus cost versus value?
Great.
It's a great question. As I look at this and I look at price and value, it is about where you go, right? What institution is really giving you the value and what does it cost? You know, when you look at my state colleges and universities, the average tuition, still a lot of money for some people, is between $12,000 and $14,000 for a 4-year degree if you go through in 4 years.
Yeah.
Hey, if we were smart on how to help those families come out with no debt, the value is there.
Yeah.
And you're still getting a quality education, right? And so, but if you go to some of these for-profits and you pay all this debt and you walk away with no position or you drop out, which is even worse,
Right.
then you are in deep trouble.
Yeah.
And it is about institutions being held accountable
Yeah.
for what happens to the students that you agreed to enroll on your institutions. It's not those students you wish you had, it's the students that you have enrolled in your institution.
You know, so much of what we learn in life is that humility and modesty are overrated. If you don't tell your story, nobody else will. You got to jump up and down and wave your arms and stamp your feet. Is part of the problem here that higher ed is not doing a good enough job of conveying its own value? Or is this on the institutions to some degree, that they're not taking ownership of the messaging of this?
I think so. As a matter of fact, our last conference with our 400 presidents was telling our story.
Don't be so modest about your successes.
Don't be so modest about our success. We had Melinda Gates, thank you, she was at our conference, talking about the importance of being able to talk about, and be honest, right? Tell your story and then talk about how you're improving in the areas that you need to improve on. I don't think that us as presidents are doing what we need to do collectively in telling our story. And that is why we've started a task force on the Values Commission, where our institutions have asked you are moving forward the recommendations as part of an organization. Because the public is not hearing from us, they're hearing from the $200,000 that a student is in debt. That is not our story. And we have to be vocal and provide data and evidence.
Boss, are we talking enough
Well,
about
I think there's some fairness there, absolutely. But I don't want us to come across as defensive that there's not enough work to do.
No, I think
because
we
a lot of
need
people
to
have
be honest about both sides
a
of it.
lot
right?
of debt
Right,
and have not, garnered the kind of worthiness of that.
So we're not talking enough about the
data.
The underside, the underbelly of this.
Right.
What else are we not talking enough about?
Well, I think and it's happening from the private sector. These credentialing programs, the Amazons, the Googles, the Microsoft, whoever, that are offering these very, affordable, quick, trajectories into a job are, keeping us on the run.
Anything
and so,
wrong with that?
Not a thing in my view.
So you think they're essentially eating higher ed's lunch in terms of
Well, I
providing
think
that
they're
kind of
challenged. I
competition?
would say it differently. I think they're challenging us to be as responsive to the needs of the student.
But isn't an expanded competitive set the kind of thing that we always hear will spur higher ed to do better?
Yes.
Theoretically?
Yeah.
And, I do think that these Googles and everybody else is helping us think, look, higher ed is in the middle of a huge transformation.
Yeah.
And we have to think about where our students will be, and we prepare them for a position that they need right now in order to survive. But help them to move on later, to move on. How many of our students, especially, I'm a community college student. How many of our community college students graduate and thinking the associate's degree is the last thing, and then they decide, no, I loved my community college, I'm going to move forward. And so we prepare some people for professions and then help them move on. And we have to be more entrepreneurial. There's no question about that. And be true about who we're really educating. Because the other underside of the belly is that we're not graduating students of color, especially Hispanics and African American and underrepresented Asian Americans, Native Americans, at the rate that we should be. And we should be held accountable.
And this, Secretary Spellings, is a particular challenge for Texas.
Absolutely.
Where according to the census, we've now passed 60% of our residents are people of color for the first time in the history of the state. That trend line is not going to reverse. By 2040, maybe before 2040, will be Hispanic majority. White residents of Texas will represent less than a third of the population. There were racial disparities before the pandemic. They're worse now. And higher ed is not reflecting the diversity of the state in terms of either to or through.
Correct.
So what do we do about that? I mean, I'm certainly going to talk to both Commissioner Morath and Commissioner Keller about that in a bit.
And what has saved us is the in-migration of folks from all over the country and all over the world who
tech bros from California bringing their
who've
kids.
been better educated than our native, homegrown, whatever word population. And that is the number one issue for our state, is how well we develop our people. And what Texas 2036's mission is to talk more about that and make it data focused and whatnot, and build what I call civic demand for a conversation about this. Are we hearing that in the political primaries? No, we're hearing about everything but that.
Good.
And so, anyway.
Oh, you brought up politics. I might ask you a question about that in a minute or two. You held the door open. I'll blame you if people start booing.
Right.
So to this point, in Texas, Secretary Spellings, in Texas, we now have a matriculation rate of less than 50% for high schoolers. Why? First of all, why? And then second of all, what are we going to have to do about it? What do you think the factors are that get us to that? For a state that talks about how exceptional it is, there's nothing exceptional about 50%.
The soft bigotry of low expectations,
I've heard that phrase
as my
before.
former boss described it, that there is an okayness with the fact that we have 50%, largely the students that Millie has been referencing, are those kids, and nobody seems to give a damn. I used to say in my secretarial days, if half the school lunches served in the cafeterias were tainted, people would be on fire. Half the kids getting out of college,
Yeah.
I mean, high school.
Dr. Garcia, if we were having this conversation in another state, California, Florida, a small state, would we be talking about numbers like that? Would the challenges be the same challenges?
I think they are the same challenges across the nation.
Yeah.
And it is not only Texas. Texas is demonstrating the new majority of America, but so is California, so is New York. I mean, you could go across the country.
Right.
What we haven't come to the realization in this country that people of color will be in the majority. And if we do not educate them, it is not only about the family and the student, it is about your community, your state, and your nation. I have presidents telling me, if my campus was not in this city would not be here. Because the faculty live there, the students live there, they buy there, their communities there, their leaders there. So we haven't made that story told, that it's going to hit you in your pocketbook, because who's going to pay your Social Security if it survives, if these people are not working?
Right.
So Secretary Spellings, through the lens of the work that you do, again, back to Text 2036, you're thinking intentionally about workforce development from now until the bicentennial of Texas. We have a very low unemployment rate in Texas. Back in May, it was May of 2019, we hit our record low unemployment. We then spiked up within a year to the record high, and we are now almost all the way back down from an unemployment rate. So on the one hand, we're not sending enough kids to school, preparing them sufficiently for the workforce of today and of tomorrow. On the other hand, we have an extraordinarily tight labor market in the sense that what's going on? Is it out-of-state talent pipeline? Is that what it is? Like, what's going on here that's causing us to not suffer for not having enough kids go through higher ed?
Growth of business, growth of opportunity, all these corporate relocations, all of that.
So we shouldn't misread the low unemployment rate as everything's fixed.
Absolutely.
Wash your hands of it.
We've got some, short term, things are kind of rocking along, but it's the issues that Millie's talking about and why we need to think about the next 14 years for our state and take the longer view, not the next tweet, but the next decade.
Right. So I want to get to some solutions here. I don't want to just identify problems. I want to talk about what we can do. So first of all, Secretary, what can the higher ed leaders in this room and not in this room do to attack this problem? If you could tell them this is 1, 2, 3, the things that you need to do to own your end of this, what would it be?
And this is going to be on the program later today. We are obviously a huge state, 254 counties, and when you've seen one, you've seen one.
Right.
And so if we're going to have a statewide strategy to meet our statewide needs, very disparate needs, we have to kind of lift up at the policy level, and we have to have greater connectedness and incentives in the system for that greater connectedness at the workforce, K-12, and post-secondary levels. And we've started to have some steps toward this, but right now we have these 3 very distinct silos. And none of the incentives are built in.
And the silos are?
The Workforce Commission and all the things that relate to that. K-12 and the preparedness and the readiness for people to be successful in post-secondary and higher ed.
Yeah, but we're going to blow your mind at how aligned those 3 are in the next session, so stay tuned, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other thing, Well, let me just say,
Good one, boss.
if we were doing well, I think we'd have better outcomes.
Yeah, if the alignment were really there,
Right.
you think we'd have better outcomes.
I would.
Dr. Garcia, what do you think higher ed can do to attack this problem?
Well, of course, state goals, number one, but
Right.
number two, it's also local. What is that institution doing in having an intentional, consistent, accountable plan, working towards student success,
Yeah.
and making sure you're using the data? You know, it is very clear that if the president is holding that group, that team accountable, and the chancellor or the board is holding that president accountable, people are going to start to pay attention. There has to be.
Yeah.
There has to be some accountability on each and every one of our campuses. And our campuses have to understand that, as I said earlier, these students are not monolithic. So get to know who you are enrolling, understand them, speak to families, go to those communities, and ensure that they understand that your institution is a place for them, and help them to get through the process.
Is the kind of accountability you're talking about public-facing accountability or internal accountability? You know, we have a situation, Secretary, where Texas Education Agency controversially grades in a very public way schools and districts A through F. We have no comparable accountability, public-facing accountability system on higher ed. Should there be one?
That's a whole other panel.
No.
Here's
Give it to me right now.
Here's
Come on.
Here's what we need to do is put our money where our mouths are in terms of the incentives in our funding systems for higher education.
Outcomes-based funding.
Well, right now, let's just posit, there are great rewards, this is true across the country, for people who are getting Ph.D.s in, you name it, pick your favorite foil, and not as many incentives on these, on associate's degrees and on baccalaureate credentials.
So you'd rather have incomes-based funding than
Well, I'd
outcomes-based
rather
funding,
have,
right?
put our money where we say our goals are, where we want the outcomes. Right now, we're paying big premiums for graduate education. And yes, those things pay dividends for sure, but it's a different, so stop talking about opportunities for all people then.
So if I'm a higher ed leader sitting here with the two of you, what I'm thinking of is the slide that Kristen Boyer showed, that the state is basically out of the business of funding higher education at this point. I mean, the drop in higher ed funding, it's pretty alarming. It is one of those difficult slides to look at. So
For sure.
Do you think that the state needs to get back in the business of sufficiently funding higher ed? 29.1 million people in the state of Texas today, according to the census, going to perhaps 54 million by 2050. Those people are not going to educate themselves. And so if higher ed's going to be tasked with doing all the things that you, and I'll come to you in a second on the same thing, Dr. Garcia, that you both are saying, they can't just do it on wishes and hopes. They've got to keep the lights on. And so the question is, why are we allowing a situation in the legislature to persist where higher ed funding is taking it on the chin consistently to the point that slide was that slide?
Because there have been no consequences that the folks can see, and we have not created the necessary civic demand. So absolutely, should we restore more funding for higher education? You bet. But we also ought to get something for it in terms of meeting the needs of the population that is before us and that will predict the future of Texas, and we can do that. And it's uber wonkery about success points and faculty incentives and tenure tracks and all of those things. But it certainly can be done.
Dr. Garcia, from a national perspective on this question of funding, we love bumper stickers in Texas. I could see one after that slide that says, Texas, at least we're not Pennsylvania, right? I mean, in terms of funding. But obviously, this is not a problem specific just to Texas, because other states are suffering through a version of the same thing where we've basically gotten out of the business of funding higher ed.
Well, I agree with Margaret 100%, but there's a couple of other things that I would say. We have to start educating our students to vote for things that are important, to understand how the political process works. So when we were in California, and Lauren Blanchard is here, and he was at the chancellor's office, students would come to talk to me about, why did you raise my tuition? And it is about educating that the state is taking away money from us.
Right.
And so when students and families start to understand that's long range, but I think it's important. The other thing we have to start looking at is, let's be real. Because first generation low-income students of color, et cetera, are not getting the foundation that they desperately need to be successful, Higher ed is taking on a lot of this burden. Right. If you're educating those students and you graduate them, you should be getting more money, because it's easier to get someone that went to a very private school to get them through.
Right.
And not so easy. More money for those institutions. We have to work on doubling Pell and increasing Pell on the federal level. And what about the states and the federal government pulling their money together so that it's not so complicated for students to get financial aid? So those are a couple of things that I think about at night.
Secretary, let me ask you what state leaders specifically in this state can do to solve this problem. Are there things that they can do, either ways they can talk about higher ed differently than they're talking about higher ed, or tangible actions they can take?
Yes, both. I think, I'm putting this out to the universe, that our leaders, all of them, start talking about the centrality of developed people, educated and healthy people, to the future of our state.
Right.
And there are lots of solutions on the right and the left, and the incentives and whatnot, but that our imperative and our aspiration as a state is something that no one's talking about now on either side of the aisle.
Right.
So,
when I
and what can they do?
Yeah.
They can more adequately fund higher education and K-12 education around some expectations, accountability, transparency, data. The cookbook that we had in place in Texas, where we were 33rd in the nation on early reading, and now we're 47th. So, taking your foot off the gas on this stuff has consequences. So leadership is what I'm saying.
I'm thinking of the fact that we're here at the end of a week in which the lieutenant governor decided that higher ed was so unimportant that we're going to relegate it to a subcommittee of an education committee. What kind of a message does that send? Think about what percentage of higher ed funding is of the overall state budget. Now it's going to be a subcommittee? You have a point of view about that?
It would not be what I would have recommended. And may I say, we have to build civic demand, what I call civic demand, and challenge this kind of stuff. This tenure stuff is ridiculous.
Well, I was going to ask you, is threatening to get rid of tenure bringing up the proposition of value in higher education?
Watch the birdie. It's more dog whistle stuff.
You think this is all political stuff?
Things like
Dr. Garcia, it may just be the case in Texas, but if you listen to state leaders talk about higher ed, you would think that we have essentially a whole bunch of college campuses full of woke lunatics, and that's all we have in Texas. Is this the same conversation in other states?
Yeah, absolutely, it's the same conversation in other states, and I find it fascinating that these political leaders are the very ones that went to higher ed, that got value out of higher ed, that send their children to private schools, but don't want it for others. And I do think it's civic, but it's also advocacy, and calling them out on it, and being very clear that you're not being very honest, and you're doing this as a political chip to get elected. Yeah. And we are just too quiet and too laid back. Maybe I'm a child of the late 60s. And that is the reason why I think we talk about woke, we better woke up. Because this is really going to threaten higher education and threaten our nation.
Yeah. You mentioned the Pell Grants. I want to ask you off of the state piece what the federal government can do. It's complicated in Texas. The only thing we hate more than the federal government in Texas is California, right? We have state leaders who brag about getting up in the morning, going into the office, suing the federal government, and coming home. We don't really have a great working relationship with the federal government. You talk about the need to double Pell Grants. Should we be working more closely and intentionally with the federal government to look at things that we can partner on or agree on? Does the federal government have a constructive role to play in this debate?
Absolutely. There is no question about it that we need to work together. And if we all work together to double Pell, it would help Texas, because the students would have the dollars to have the true cost of attendance to go to college. And it is the very students that is the majority in this state.
Right.
And Secretary, you were the federal government. That was you. You had responsibility, purview for this when you were there. You understand this from the inside out.
And we made good progress on Pell. And it's a thing, as Millie knows, that it is quite bipartisan. It's one of the things that can be done. Yeah. One of the things that can't be done is saying we're going to select a type of institution, like community colleges, and saying that will be free, but the HBCU will cost, et cetera. So when you put your muscle around Pell, we can create a constituency to enact.
I'll also note that we hate the federal government until they show up with stimulus dollars, right? I mean, the reality is, what is saving the chestnuts of higher ed this time is ARPA
and K-12.
and K-12. It's federal money that, by the way, is going to go away, right? It's a one-time deal, and so we can't actually count on that. Secretary Spellings, what about the business community? So how does the business community plug into this conversation in a more constructive and productive way? What would you advise those folks to say or do?
Many of them, and I know Richard would echo this, are very much involved in their local efforts. And they're playing the short game at the moment because they have jobs to fill right now. Right. And so they come in and I worked at Austin Community College and attended HCC, so I know a little something about this. And I think in isolated examples, it's going pretty well. But my hope would be that they get more engaged and more vigorous in the creation of a more responsive state system, state policy infrastructure that could drive some of this and get more knowledgeable and help us play the long game for the employment sector of the future. So you'd like to see
the business community in Texas, say, or Dr. Garcia nationally, band together in an effort to communicate the importance of higher ed.
Yes, like we did, and frankly, they've done that in K-12 for a long time, and much less so in post-secondary.
Right.
Absolutely. I had heard that there was a state looking at putting together a group of individuals that included higher ed, that included business, not-for-profit, the media, to talk about where is the state going and what is needed. They never said it was education, and they never said it was higher education, but it came out being higher ed. And if we are all working together with all the stakeholders, maybe we can get somewhere.
And what our leaders can do is convene this sort of thing. Really, I mean, that's what I would wish that our big three would find forums to create that kind of authorized forum.
Right. Well, they've been threatening to have a higher ed session for some time now. Maybe this will actually be the higher ed session. Maybe there'll be an intentional focus.
With the subcommittee to see about
exactly.
it.
Yeah, done with the subcommittee. Kristen, we've got about 20 minutes left, and I do want to bring people very smarter than me in the audience into this conversation for questions. So would you prefer that people just put their hands up and use their outside voice? How do you want to do this? Okay. If you want to have somebody come around and collect cards, we're happy to take questions on cards. But honestly, if you have a question, this is informal. Put your hand up. We're happy to bring you into the conversation. You've got two of the smartest people in higher ed in front of you. Ma'am. And then we'll go to the back.
There are a number of employers. There's very little
Right. So you're wondering, is there going to be accountability on the employer end as well?
I'm just curious.
I think there can be. I think the employer community, and this is, I've been involved in Texas politics for a long time, is afraid to step out on some of this stuff because they have other business with the legislature. They're too busy trying to kill the bathroom bill, so they're not going to expend political capital on behalf of additional resources. I'm making this example up. And so that's just, I think they're afraid, and they have their own, parochial issues to attend to, and so that's why.
But of course, I mean.
And they're playing the short game too. Let's face it.
Thank you. But of course, the counter to that, Secretary Spellings, is it actually costs them more political capital to come out against the bathroom bill or the investigations of the families of transgender kids than it would to come out for something as apple pie and motherhood as higher ed.
No, it's more, I want to protect my, tax advantaged status. Therefore, I'm not going to go up there and say more money for higher ed. I'm more worried about everybody has self-interest. I get it. Yeah. And why creating these safe forums, if you will, for people to work in.
But as somebody who believes, let me just push you a little bit on this. As somebody who believes in accountability, isn't it reasonable to ask employers whether they're recruiting in line with the values that we all say we want this to advance? The whole question of Chapter 313, which is about to go away, the economic incentives for businesses that locate in Texas. One of the big sticking points over the years on all economic incentives has been they take our money, they say they're going to create a whole bunch of jobs, and then do they actually do that? It seems reasonable to say if you're going to get the money.
I think in those instances where we have a lever, like a tax incentive, then yeah, we can ask for that sort of thing. But, to just unilaterally say, everyone can't or everyone must get vaccinated, sort of intruding in the prerogatives of the private sector, right. Just as a one-off, to me is a little treacherous. I think we can do better than that. I think this self-interest, I think, shareholders are demanding this sort of thing. I think employers can use their employee benefits more strategically, on and on and on.
Okay. But there's a question in the back, and then I'll take a question that we have here on the card. Ma'am.
Yes, I wanted to ask you both to speak about the idea of K through 14 as opposed to K through 12. You haven't spoken about that, but the idea that folks can continue on and get an additional 2 years of education for free that might be the equivalent of an associate's degree, or in some cases, a 4-year degree. We see a lot of students coming out of high school, especially here in Texas, right, that have already completed close to 2 years of college. So it's a different way to get at free college without free college.
Dr. Garcia, what do you think?
So I do think it would be good, but it has to be equitable. So I'm all for community colleges getting the 2-year if the same students that choose to go to a 4-year public are also free. And the reason they're not moving in that direction is because it's going to cost the country a lot of money, and they don't want to go in that direction. But this was a major conversation that we had in Washington, D.C. among the 6. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you that the community college, one of the community college individuals, not the president, was a little angry that we were taking such a position. But when you look at the students that go to the community colleges and you look at the students that go to ASCU institutions, all the difference is that they decide to go to the 4-year institution rather than the 2-year institution. And so where's the equity here? We're going to talk about equitable access.
So I'm just clear on this. There is obviously within the political universe a push in some circles to do free community college. You would oppose it unless you also made the first 2 years of 4-year free.
Equitable for those students that need free.
Are you a fan of free? Are you a fan of free college?
But free is. May I say something else?
Yeah. Free is not free.
Free is not free. That's free to the student. Somebody's paying.
Right. No, I get that. Are you a fan of free college?
To me, we need to make every high school a community college, essentially. Let everybody get a level of preparedness, whether it's proffered by the local comprehensive institution, the local community college, have those opportunities, some of which could be technologically based, et cetera, in that high school.
Right.
And, also make sure kids that leave high school have a high school education. But I want to echo Millie in one sense, and that is that kids who are well matched into comprehensive universities like HBCUs, complete at higher levels. That's just what the data tells us. So as taxpayers, don't we want to, make sure that those resources are getting the most?
Is it either or is it both and?
I think it's not. I think it's both and. I think let's put more rigor in our high schools everywhere, always, and have those opportunities for kids to have 2 years of college when they leave high school. And in that sense, we're all for K-14. And whoever provides that level of rigor on the high school, I'm agnostic.
Okay. Here's a question that came in on a card. Apprenticeships are becoming an area of increasing interest. Apprenticeships. Mm-hmm. Please discuss your thoughts on the value of apprenticeships and the role of higher ed in terms of workforce preparation and long-term impact on income versus a more traditional career to college to career pathway.
I mean, I think they're important. They're expensive. They're not systemic particularly. It's not the way we're going to walk over the big bridge to the holy land of access for everybody. Is it a tool in our toolkit? Yes.
But it's a tool.
It's a tool.
Yeah.
I agree with that, and I also think when you're talking about, I would say paid internships for students is critical, and there are institutions that are actually, as Sam Houston State, for example, has short-term paid internships for students. That is important because it gives them an understanding of what they're walking into, and they're getting some money. And there are many institutions, ASCU institutions in particular, that are working on internships in the area in which they are studying.
Right,
and
well,
they have to be paid.
But the problem with unpaid internships, isn't it, that you have a lot of kids who come to you and they want to do an internship, but if you can't pay them, they may be someone who have to take a job to pay
for
tuition.
Sure. Only
You
advantaged
force
kids can
them
afford to work for
you
free.
force them to make a choice between paying their tuition and the pre-professional, and it needs to be the same thing.
Right, absolutely.
Right. All agreed on that.
Yes.
Of course. Good. Phipps.
Hey,
Thank you,
John.
sir. John Fitzpatrick, Educate Texas. Dr.
We
Garcia,
know.
Secretary of Spellings, thank you for being
Nice
here.
meeting you.
Could you talk a little bit about productive and unproductive ways that you're seeing states and maybe this commission take on this idea of both workforce credentials and certificates and the value of a degree? In Texas, in the four-year arena, we had under Governor Perry, I think it was the red and black competition, where they were basically scoring, a romance literature degree versus chemical engineering.
Right.
We've got the debate now about tenure, which is a sort of higher ed CRT. It's coming.
Right.
But I think it gets to this issue of what's the job you're going to get with this particular degree. In community colleges, it's been less destructive so far, but there's this whole issue about transfer versus dual credit versus certificates, credentials, and the workforce
Ed.
arena. But what are you seeing either in the commission that you served on? What are you seeing in New York, California, Florida, different states that's productive, that either takes this on together or is productive separately?
I think we have to start with much better data, and I commend the tri-agency group, and we passed some legislation, as you know, last session, and it's under sale, and the recasting of the goals and so on. But one of the things that was so powerful and valuable and made this work so useful is that we had a lot of data around it. It wasn't and we in higher education have been pretty resistant to that. Jen and I were talking this morning at breakfast. I mean, here's, this story, but there was a huge backlash after the so-called Spellings Commission to tamp down the ability for higher ed data to be collected and reported. Now the higher ed community is trying to lead us out of that wilderness, and let's get more data so that we can tell our story, so that we can frame the value proposition. And we're a long way from doing that. So we've got to start with, what are the facts? Why is it just scene one? And so, we're not even to a decisional place in a lot of ways because there's so much murkiness. So that's where we should start.
I agree with Margaret, and I think thanks to Gates and how we are measuring will show that it is about, if you take a liberal arts degree, it comes out in the wash and you're going to be fine, right? But people have to know that, but you have to have the data. And you have to look at degrees and understand, yes, education is not going to be paying more than STEM, but there's also a satisfaction level here for people who go into a profession that we're not even dealing with. That you're in this business because you love students and you love education. And you're not making the CEO money at a business, but you're living a comfortable, economically independent life. And we don't talk about that data either. And so it's both and in using your data and making sure that you tell everybody about that.
Let me take another question from a card here. Does the work of the Values Commission and other similar efforts end up just reinforcing the worth of certain disciplines and credentials over others? Could this risk our limited grant aid dollars then following suit?
I certainly don't see that because they're looking at, as I just said, you'll look at education, let's say you're majoring in education, they'll look at that, they'll look at social workers, they'll look at STEM fields. Within those areas, how are those students doing? And are they moving along? The Gates Values Commission definition is looking for economic independence and a fulfilling life after having a post-secondary degree. And we have to have that data. By program, programs matter, but you have to educate students on what does it mean to take that program and what your life will be like and what your income will be like,
But
and be honest.
And if you want to be a social worker, it's probably smarter for you to go to a community college and a comprehensive public
Absolutely.
university than to go to a fancy high-priced liberal arts college.
Absolutely.
And we just ought to be honest with students about that.
Okay. Sure.
Hello.
Yeah.
Question for Secretary Spellings. You mentioned earlier that there's a ton of zero value or no value credentials in your data reporting in your landscape of the state of Texas. I was just curious, are you seeing any trends in specific credentials or degrees or certificates that are the most valuable across the state of Texas, looking at the statewide landscape versus, say, a regional landscape?
Sure, you bet. And you know, I hope when we walk out here at ACC, we're going to see the posters for these jobs, but they're healthcare, they're technology, they're cyber, they're STEM.
These are the high value.
Yeah, the high value. And we ought to be honest with kids. Sure, you can take on a lot of debt, and 15 years from now, you know, you'll be in a happy place and, you know, making a living wage. But that is a choice, you know, caveat emptor and all that. But we're not honest with kids. We really aren't. We put up a poster, and I'm not going to pick on anybody here, but, you know, a little girl playing a guitar. And, I mean, this is Austin. There is a music industry. But, you know, we act like it's all the same. I mean, not everybody can afford everything. When you go to the grocery store, you can't go to, you know, Dean and DeLuca to buy your toilet paper, you know. Got to go to Costco. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Am I kidding? Is this making sense?
I'm just imagining the headline. Former education secretary says higher ed should be more like Costco. Might be the headline, actually.
Well, in some cases it should be. And Dean and DeLuca, and we, you know.
Yeah, all right. We've got time maybe for one or two more. Ma'am, right here.
Equity is, for me, is giving everyone, regardless of background, race, class, religion, an opportunity to reach their highest goal in post-secondary education and get there on equal basis as everyone else. That, for me, is equity. And I am so tired of people hijacking our language in order to use it against us politically. And we have to continue to educate that critical race theory is not diversity, equity, and inclusion in social justice, that it is a philosophy that is used in law school, that is not even taught in P14, and have people speak out about this. They may not listen because this is about votes, but I think this is really clear for me that they are hijacking words in order to divide a nation, which is very dangerous.
Secretary?
Attending to equity will determine the future of our state, period, full stop. And so whether it's morally right and responsible, you know, economically prudent, you know, whatever your reason, if we don't do that, we're going nowhere fast. And we're not going to live in a very nice place because we're going to have a lot of people who are disenfranchised, unfulfilled, poor. It'll be a miserable place. And we've already gotten, as my boss says, all the people from California who want to work. So we better get about the business of making sure.
What kind of a job would you say higher ed institutionally in Texas does with regard to equity? There's talk of equity all the time. Mm-hmm. Is there actually action behind that talk in terms of advancing the cause of equity?
The results would suggest not a very good job. I mean, that's just, if we're looking at the outcomes, how many Hispanic kids, African American kids, get a college credential within 6 years? We're not doing a very good job. So I'd probably say, you know, there's a lot of want to, but not enough we've done it. And I'd say maybe a C-.
Okay. Got 2 minutes, so we can take one more question quickly. Ma'am in the back, yes.
Hi, I'm in career services, so I'll preface and say that. What do you think that institutions can do at the institutional level when it comes to career planning with students to help them with a lot of these issues that we're talking about today, especially coming from a freshman year on, say if they're going through that 4-year experience from direct high school to college? A lot of students have the idea that career services or something similar to that is only appropriate like when they're getting ready to graduate. And we see a lot of good data coming out from schools that are really making it intentional of starting students off in that area from beginning to end of that. So any thoughts on that?
For me, it is about starting the minute they walk on campus. Let's remember who we're educating, and they don't even know the wealth of options that are out there that they can really major in. And so it should start on very early on. And what we did at Cal State Fullerton when I was president, we had student success teams in each college, starting from when they walked in. And in there was career advising. And those heads would talk to each other in case that someone in the liberal arts decided to major in geometry or something, that they would talk to each other after they learned about what are the possibilities in the areas in which they think they want to major in. I mean, college has always been a place to explore, and we have to help students who come from backgrounds that don't understand what is really out there. What are the jobs of the future? What are these high-value jobs? People, my girlfriend Laura Rendon, a researcher, really wrote about families, Latino families not understanding what to do with a STEM degree and how to help families understand. So it's a long process. It has to start from the beginning, and career education and career values have to be at the center from the minute they walk in of the institution, and not someplace over there that you use when you're graduating.
And I would add that needs to start in high school. And that advising is, underdeveloped, underinvested in post-secondary and in secondary education, but can pay big dividends if we do it right.
All right, we're at time. Please give Dr. Garcia, Secretary of Spelling's big hand. Thank you very much.